So I'm Cal Rastiala. I direct the Burkle Center for International Relations here at UCLA. And on behalf of the center, I want to welcome you to the 2016 Daniel Pearl Memorial Lecture. The Burkle Center plays many roles on campus, but I think one of the most prominent and important is we try to bring the most interesting, the most important, the most thoughtful thinkers and doers here to UCLA to talk with us about the most pressing issues in the world. And tonight's lecture is part of that tradition. The Daniel Pearl Lecture honors the life and work of Daniel Pearl, who shortly after the 9/11 attacks was brutally murdered in Pakistan while working as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. A free and active press has been an essential part of our democracy since our founding, and as a foreign correspondent, Daniel Pearl played an important role in that tradition. He devoted his life to seeking truth about the world around us and to bringing it to us at home. So I can't think of a more fitting individual for this year's Daniel Pearl Memorial Lecture than our special guest, Christiane Amanpour. She's an exemplary foreign correspondent, familiar to all of us. She has a long history of also seeking truth and bringing perspective to us and bringing the best and often the worst of the world right into our living rooms. So I'm really pleased that I know the Pearl family is really pleased to have her here. So we'll begin, as we usually do, with a few words of remembrance by Judea Pearl, Daniel's father, president of the Daniel Pearl Foundation, and of course an esteemed professor of computer science here at UCLA. Ms. Amanpour will then come up, speak for a few minutes, as long as she likes, here at the podium. She and I will then sit down, have a brief conversation, and we'll open it up to questions from all of you. Now, we have handheld microphones, so I ask you to please raise your hands, of course, wait for the microphone. I will call on you. When you get the microphone, if you could just identify yourself and keep your questions short and to the point. So, please join me in welcoming to the stage Judea Pearl.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Carl, for the introduction. See friends, colleagues, students, supporters of the foundation, and all members of the UCLA community for whom this annual Daniel Pearl Memorial Lecture has become a cultural landmark of shared values and shared aspirations. I want to say a few words about the connection between Danny and our speakers, Christiane Amanpour. Since his death, Danny has become an icon to many ideas and many ideals. First, to fellow Americans, he came to represent the America we knew and loved, America that stretches a friendly hand to the less fortunate part of the world, an America that gives and cares without asking for return. Second, to the Muslim world, Danny's strategy came to symbolize their own struggle against violence and extremism and for democracy and renaissance and freedom of the press. To the Jewish community, Danny's last word, "I'm Jewish," came to represent the right of every individual to assert his or her heritage and identity and to find dignity in being different. One can also mention musicians, but I believe that it is the journalism community to whom Danny's journey became most significant. For them, Danny came to represent the nobleness of the profession, the courage and integrity of hundreds of young men and women who roam the globe with a camera and a laptop in search for the truth. Now, in Danny's first memorial service, one of his high school friends remarked, Danny had only one religion, the religion of truth. Now, being a part-time scientist, I thought I knew something about truth, but I couldn't quite get the religious part. So I say, why should simple facts on the ground acquire divine qualities when they move from one place where they are known to a place where they are not known but need to be known? I'm sure that our speaker tonight, Christiane Amanpour, will shed light on this puzzling religion of truth and on this obsession of journalists to see things with their own eyes, because many, more than anyone else that I know, Christians embody the idea of seeing things with your own eyes. The last time that Christiane met Danny was in 2001 in a hotel in Islamabad, Pakistan. Danny wished her goodbye and good luck when she was prepared to go to Afghanistan to see things with her own eyes. After Danny's murder, Christiane was the first to join the honorary board of the Daniel Pearl Foundation and has remained committed to the foundation mission and programs through the years. When HBO produced a documentary, The Journalist and the Jihadi, Christiane volunteered to be the narrator and saw it as a personal calling to tell not merely Danny's story, but also the stories of all journalists who are putting their lives on the line to bring us what we normally call the news. And when the Daniel Pearl International Journalism Institute opened in Herzliya, Israel, Christiane was among the first to join the International Advisory Board. And finally, coming for this lecture tonight, not only did she take precious time from her super busy schedule, but she also agreed to be interviewed by student reporters from the Daniel Pearl High School in Van Nuys, California. It's a gesture that I see as the irony of history, or perhaps her victory. 15 years after waving her goodbye in Islamabad, Daniel is meeting her again, this time through his followers in the Religion of Truth, fellow journalists from the Daniel Pearl High School for Journalism and Communication, recently rated second in the nation and winner of several journalism awards. Tamara, my daughter, Ruth, and I thank you deeply, Christiane, for honoring our son with your lecture tonight and for everything you have done to keep his legacy alive. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Christiane Amanpour. As Judea Pearl mentioned, she is CNN's chief international correspondent and anchor of its flagship global affairs program, Amanpour. She began her career as an assistant at the International Assignment Desk in CNN's Atlanta headquarters in 1983. But it was her fearless, compelling, and passionate coverage of both the First Gulf War and especially the Yugoslav wars that brought her to global prominence. On the ground during the siege of Sarajevo, Christiane Amanpour exposed the brutality of the Bosnian War, reporting on the daily tragedy for life for civilians in the city day by day. She was outspoken, calling out the human rights abuses she witnessed and saw, and later saying, there are some situations one simply cannot be neutral about, because when you are neutral, you are an accomplice. Ms. Amanpour was soon intrepidly covering myriad hotspots from Haiti and Rwanda to Somalia and Afghanistan, and by 1996, Newsweek said that her reporting had helped make CNN, quote, must-see TV for world leaders. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, she was the first international correspondent to interview Prime Minister Tony Blair, Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf, and Afghan President Hamid Karzai. During the height of the Arab Spring, she conducted an Emmy-winning interview, his last, with Libya's former leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. She was also the last journalist to interview Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak before he was deposed. In 2009, her signature show, Amanpour, was launched. And on that show, she's continued to interview an incredibly wide range of world leaders, decision makers, and thinkers. Following his landslide election victory, Christiane Amanpour spoke exclusively to Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, eliciting from him acknowledgement of the occurrence of the Holocaust. She's also reported from the aftermath of many of the world's most serious humanitarian crises, including the devastating earthquake in Haiti, the Japanese tsunami, and Hurricane Katrina. So in addition to all of that, her work as an anchor and a reporter, she's an active human rights campaigner. She's a board member of the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Center for Public Integrity, and the International Women's Media Foundation. She has earned every major television journalism award known to man and woman, including 11 News and Documentary Emmy Awards, 4 Peabody Awards, 2 George Polk Awards, 3 DuPont Columbia Awards, and the Courage in Journalism Award. She's an honorary citizen of Sarajevo and a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for the freedom of the press and the safety of journalists, something she knows intimately. So please join me in welcoming to UCLA.
Thank you, Cal. It's nice to be back here again. It's a little bit like family, I think, coming back here. It's great to be with you, Yuda, Ruth, Tamara, and the greater Daniel Pearl family. I will start by saying, just to put this in perspective, that when I landed at LAX today, I picked up the LA Times, and I saw that the whole of this city was abuzz with Kobe Bryant's last game, which is tonight. So I'm sure everybody is over there. But one thing struck me, and that was a description of him on the first page in which they talked about, you know, he'd been there for, I think he's been there for 20 years. He arrived as a 17 or 18-year-old. Now he's 37 years old. And they were talking about how in his last games, there he was on the bench, you know, they said mummified in bags of ice because his body hurt so much. And they described how he nearly collapsed because his knees were hurting so badly when he got off the bench. So I thought, you know what? It is amazing how people can give it their all. He's a really young guy. He's 37 years old, and perhaps he's physically just can't do it anymore. And I'm thinking, well, I'm about 20 years older than him, and we have a whole different level of physical threat. And it's not just our shoulders and our knees and things like that, and we get paid substantially less as well. But it is a major threat to our freedom, for the number of journalists who are incarcerated around the world, a major threat to our bodily integrity for the number of journalists who are wounded around the world, and a major threat to our lives for the number of journalists who are killed around the world. Danny, it is hard to believe, was brutally slaughtered 15 years ago. It is hard to believe that this amount of time has passed. And sadly, for me, and I'm sure obviously for everybody, his was a death that wasn't alone. It started a very brutal wave against journalists. And that has made it incredibly difficult for journalists to continue doing this job, to do what Yuda says, which is to be committed to the religion of truth and to be passionate beyond words, sometimes beyond common sense, about being the eyes and ears of everybody at home, and about voluntarily taking on that role in order to do that thing which we do, which is take that torch of light and truth and shine it in all the dark corners where a load of very bad people do very bad things that they do not want exposed. And our job is to actually expose all of that. Our job also is to know about the world and to bring the world in an understandable way to all those who we work for. Our constituents are our viewers, our readers, our listeners. Those are our constituents. We work for you. We work for them. We go places where you cannot go on your behalf in order to tell these stories. We do not sit back in ivory towers or inside the Beltway offices and repeat conventional or unconventional wisdom. We have to go out there and bring the raw material of information, which is the information. Without us, there are no people sitting around pontificating. There has to be something to pontificate about, right? I love to see things in and notice things that are written in certain newspapers and things. So, the most dangerous worldview is the worldview of those who have not viewed the world. So that, in a nutshell, is what I believe about this profession and about what some people who have not viewed the world decide to talk about and decide to, you know, how they interpret the world without ever having viewed it or having experienced it. Cal said this is going to be a lecture. It is, but in a different way. I'm going to speak for a little bit up here just about broad themes, and then we're going to dig down deeper in our conversation and open it up to questions, because I always like to know what you want to know. But suffice to say that not only are we in a civilizational and an existential war right now with what's going on with ISIS attacking, and not just in their region, but sending their foot soldiers into Europe and into our homes to attack us where we are. But we're also in a war also to be able to continue telling the truth, because it is not just the obvious ISIS with their knives and their revolting brutality, but it's also in many instances leaders around the world, whether it be in Egypt or in Russia or in the Philippines or Mexico or wherever it is, are jailing journalists, putting them on trial, doing worse, torturing them. It is the number of people who simply want to shut us up. Unlike the cause of death for most people in the world, which is disease, the cause of death for journalists is deliberate, it's murder. And that is the leading cause of death for my profession. And that has been true, and it gets worse every single year for the past at least 15, 16 years. And it's a very worrying trend. And it's not just us who go from Western organizations into the world, but even more local journalists are being denied the opportunity to do their job by all these threats that I've just spoken about. And when you don't have truth and you don't have objective information, it is very difficult to be able to run any kind of enterprise, whether it's a school, a university, whether it's a country, whatever it might be. You have to have empirical information. You, as a scientist, you know this better than I do. There are such things as facts. I inhabit a fact-based world. And in order to get those facts, we have to go there and get them. There's also obviously opinion. But in so many of the areas that we cover, and so many of the areas that are in play and at stake right now, people need to know the facts. What are the facts about what's going on in Syria? What are the facts about what might have been done and should have been done to end that war? What are the facts, let's say, about climate? What are the facts versus the merchants of doubt who are employed to create doubt and to cause a false imbalance in truth and the untruth. And that goes for many other industries. The merchants of doubt have become a growth industry to confuse people about the facts and about the truth. So our job is actually to keep putting those truthful facts out there and to constantly fact check on behalf of our, again, constituents. And whether it's in a presidential campaign, when you are bombarded with slogans and policy positions from all different sides, and not really having perhaps a reliable, immediate way to fact check, that should be our role. We should be able to help you do that. So it goes from the very important, democratic process to the equally important, in a different way, global upheaval. We need to know the facts. I think the things that worry me the most right now is obviously what's happening in the Middle East. You heard that I've been there really covering that area of the world since the first Gulf War. I've covered Saudi Arabia, all the countries around. I've covered the wars in Iraq, both of them. I've covered Iran a lot since 1991. The whole sort of evolution at the height of the Islamic Revolution to the attempt at grassroots up democratic change, not top down, but grassroots up democratic change. People trying to get better rights and more freedoms for themselves. And I've covered, obviously the wars in Yugoslavia. I think one of the young students from the school that you were talking about, the Danny Pearl School there, was asking me which was the story that affected me personally and professionally the most in all those that I've covered. And I, without hesitation, always say Bosnia, because that was truly the first major global conflict on a very visceral level that I was able to cover. The first Gulf War was a big set-piece war with armies and huge numbers of troops and hardware and aircraft. That was not a war where civilians, by and large, were targeted. But of course, the wars now are precisely that. Civilians are targeted for all sorts of reasons. So Bosnia was my first experience with that. And you learn things depending on how long you've been in a place. So it's not okay to just go in, drop out, and say, okay, I'm done. And we all spent years and years in Bosnia. And what we discovered was that this wasn't just sort of an unfortunate happenstance or some terrible sort of, ancient ethnic rivalry, or that all sides were equally guilty. It was actually a very cold, determined, calculated genocide. And I'll get to that in a moment, because it took me a while to figure it out. Because what you had there was, in this case, Orthodox Christians who wanted to cleanse an area and make it just their own ethnic zone. And to do that, they had to get rid of the Bosnian Muslims, who were European Muslims. And as you know, certainly after the Spanish Inquisition, a lot of Jews went to Bosnia, and one of the oldest Haggadahs is actually preserved in the National Museum in Bosnia. So to say that it was a very multi-ethnic, multicultural community. And we saw what was happening. And we were there at a time when the world didn't want to do anything about it. And of course, there are parallels to what's happening in Syria now. So you saw the same kind of tragedy unfolding that you see unfolding because of Syria. So the years and years of a war that went on unabated, in that case, tens of thousands of civilians. In Syria's case, hundreds of thousands of civilians who've been killed. You saw a couple of million refugees emanate from the Bosnia and the Balkan wars. You've now seen, I think about 9 million refugees who've been forced from their homes in Syria, and have not just, crowded into camps around the borders, but have now, as you see, flooding into Europe, and with all that knock-on effect. But in Bosnia, for a long time, nobody wanted to deal with it. And so it was incredibly unpopular for us, and took a lot of courage, actually, to continue laying it out as it was, that it was a war of attrition, of ethnic cleansing, and of genocide. And this was happening on our watch, in the era of 24/7 news at the end of the 20th century, in total satellite 360 techno vision, really. And it became impossible, because of our constant reporting, for our democracies to continue looking away. So in 1995, when the massacre at Srebrenica happened, and 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys were separated and slaughtered just because they were Muslim in the most primitive way imaginable, the first time that had happened in Europe since the end of World War II. Finally, the United States and allies could no longer look away. And they did intervene, and they stopped the war. And they had a peace process called the Dayton Accords, which was led by the United States. And to this day, it has kept the peace. And today, 20 years later, 20 years on since Srebrenica, well, it's nearly 21 years now, but just a few weeks ago, the architect of that genocide was held accountable. Radovan Karadzic was convicted on the charge of genocide and many other crimes against humanity and other war crimes at the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. And justice was a long time coming, but it came. And that is so important for people there, obviously, because justice is the only way to see reconciliation. But it's massively important also for the people and the warlords and the dictators and the criminals who are out there trying to get away with doing the same thing today. That it may take a long time, but the world will catch up with you. And that is a very, very important milestone that was just achieved in The Hague after many, many disappointments. As I said, 20 years. He was finally caught, and the trial took a long time. Milosevic, who was the overall architect, died before there was even a verdict reached. But fast forward to Syria, why can't we do the same thing in Syria? Why don't we have the same impact in Syria? Well, to an extent, because of what happened to Danny Pearl and what happened to all these journalists who have been so brutally murdered since by ISIS, that they have had a dramatic chilling effect on the ability of journalists to go and tell these stories. And I am absolutely convinced, that because that critical mass of journalism and information and pictures and human stories have not been coming out of Syria, in the way that they did, in a very visceral and human way, because we were on the ground with them in Bosnia, and we are not in Syria, I believe that has had a huge impact on the ability to keep allowing this to carry on and to carry on. I strongly believe, based on experience, that had that been different, this war may have ended many years ago. And so just to say how vitally important I believe this profession is, and how vitally important Danny believed this profession was. He went out to tell these kinds of stories and to uncover these kinds of truth and to put a marker in the sand for accountability from our own democratic human rights and civil society, our own values that we hold so dear and that we like to export around the world for everyone else to emulate. We cannot look ourselves in the face and allow wholesale murder, a massacre of civilians, to be going on in other parts of the world. And this is not to say that the United States must be everybody's policeman. It cannot. But there are some events that are so consequential and so massive and so catastrophic that they are also in the US and in the West vital interest to intervene and to get a grip on it. Because in the 5 years that Syria has been allowed to carry on in the way it is, we have seen, as I've said, the growth of ISIS, the growth of terrorism in the region and exporting to Europe now, with the terrible deaths of people in Paris, in Belgium, in the United States at San Bernardino, in Ankara, in Africa, and Istanbul, wherever they can, they are at war with us. And it is a political war. It is not a religious war. It is a political war which uses falsely religion as their cover. But I believe it's a political war for supremacy and for superiority. And I think this is, you know, something that we really have to think about in terms of how to cover these kinds of stories, even when it's so difficult. And then I would just say, to end this little section of it before we sit down, I've also obviously been, because I have a show that goes on every night, a foreign policy show where I interview world leaders or you know, the players. We have also always, all over the world, been watching the presidential campaign in this country. And it has caused, it would be polite to say, raised eyebrows. It's caused, you know, absolute horror, shock, and incredulity all over the world. People just cannot believe what's going on here. And, you know, when they hear somebody speaking in English, or especially with an American accent, you know, everybody gloms onto them and asks them, you know, the million-dollar question. You know, who is going to be the president of the United States? Or rather, is Trump really going to be president of the United States? But I say that because this, again, goes to the heart of our mandate as journalists. There have been so many people who say, with a sense of bewildered pride and wonder, who could have thought that it could have got like this? Who knew? The thing is, there aren't enough of us in that area, which is outside the coasts, outside the ivory towers, outside the beltways of power and privilege and money, who are out there for more than one day at a time, like really out there, reporting on all these situations that are happening in the middle of the country. You know, why are people feeling the way they do to such a degree that they glom on to the kind of false promises and other things that are being sort of bandied around on the presidential campaign trail? And then I would also say, and this is probably not a popular thing to say, but and it's a bit controversial to say, but I would also say that you know, this is the land of the free, the land of the First Amendment. One of the presidential candidates, Donald Trump, is making active threats against the press at all his rallies, gathering sort of, you know, attack mobs practically against the press, manhandling a female journalist, body wrestling to the ground a photographer, and calling on his followers to chant against the press. These are very dark and dangerous things to do, because when people who would be leaders start behaving like that, it has an effect. You can't just talk like that and expect it to not have an effect. And when it does have an effect, say, gee, me, I never did anything, not my fault. And it is a very, very precarious and difficult situation what's going on in this country right now. And I think that journalism is coming late to the table of holding all candidates accountable for what they say, for what they do, and for what they promise. And I think that that's, could very easily spawn a whole nother level of disillusion, of failed promises, of people then sort of turning off politics again. And I also believe that in the same way as I report on the fractured societies and the ethnic and religious rifts around the world, America is becoming more and more of a fractured society, and these dreadfully polarized and partisan sides of the country, it's not healthy. And so I really do hope that more reporting from all over the country, and hopefully a maturing of leadership, that we can get back to a world and a country where compromise is not a dirty word, where everything is not just about identity and your tribe. It's about community and working together to make a stronger country and a stronger world. We know that that's how it works in our families. We know that that's how it works in our schools, in our local experiences, and that is how it works at a national and international level as well. I'm sitting right now in Britain, wondering what's going to happen if there's a Brexit. I mean, the completely ludicrous notion that Britain, one of the strongest countries in Europe, might pull out of the EU, based on what, I have no idea, is just ludicrous. And one of the big fears and big worries for me is, as I said, a lack of leadership in many, many, many parts of our not just our world, but our human experience. And I think courage and leadership are the two things that are in dire deficit right now. And I think that we're all paying that price, and we have to figure out how to get more courage and to get more real devoted, intelligent, competent leadership in every aspect of our endeavor and experience right now. So that's a little bit of what I have to say, and I'd be delighted to talk more with you, Cal. Should we go sit down? Yeah.
So let me start with a couple of questions about the world, and then I want to ask you a little bit about your career and profession and so forth. So we're sitting here in the heart of Tarangelis. You've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and you know a lot about Iran. You've been there many times. So I'm just curious what you think in the wake of the Iran deal. What do you see in 5 years? Do you think that Iran can become a normal country, accepted in the international community? Do you see that happening?
Look, I think that that's going to be happening now. I mean, here's the thing. The thing that scared most people about Iran was the nuclear file. And that has been dealt with in a way that is the most secure way that was possible. There was, no matter what anybody else thinks, there was no other way to deal with this. There was no better deal. There was no bombing them to smithereens. Nobody was going to be doing that. There was no leaving them and not knowing what was going on. So in my opinion, so that, perfect is not the enemy of the good, this is a good deal for the West, for the world, for Israel, and for Iran itself in many different kind of ways. So do I think it can become a normal country? Depends on what you mean. They would say, hey, we're a normal country. Sure. We had a revolution and we, But the truth of the matter is, they're not normal because their people want something different. So Iran is a country of something like 70 million or so people. I'm getting probably the number a little bit wrong, but it's a big country, big, powerful country, highly educated people, highly educated. One of the achievements of the revolution actually was spreading education to men and women in a way that it had never been before, to all levels of society, which was quite revolutionary for the region. It actually has one of the region's most educated people and most pro-Western and youngest. So the vast majority of the Iranian population is a young population which wants to be connected with the West, to be connected with the world, to be normal. to dance, to sing, to drink, to be able to practice whatever religion they want to practice, their own, and all the rest of it. To have trade and to be able to travel and to be able to be educated abroad. There is more chance of that now, but the whole freedom piece is still a very difficult, the human rights and freedom is a very, very difficult road to travel, because although the current president is more in the reform camp, I mean, he's more moderate than the very extremists, the sort of, the guy they call the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, and also the Revolutionary Guards, that group of people in Iran have vested interests. It's like when a war ends, it's really difficult to get it to end, because all the people who've profited don't want it to end. They want to keep their money flowing and their power. And if this deal really works out in a way that the people want it to work and Rouhani wants it to work, well, then these others are going to lose, and they're struggling very hard. So, as crazy as it sounds, since Rouhani was elected, there have been more people put to death. There have been more people, including Americans or Iranian Americans, imprisoned. There's been a crackdown on human rights. So it's this horrible power play that's being waged in the country in order to deny the moderates the ability to change the country. So that's what I think, yeah.
Good, thank you. So one of the big stories of the last week or so has been the Panama Papers,
yeah.
And I'm sure you've interviewed many of the world leaders and prominent individuals who have been implicated in that. And so I'm just curious, given your kind of personal connection to a lot of these people, are you surprised by this, and do you think that there's more than simply greed? What do you see explaining
it's a
this
really
activity?
interesting question. To be very honest, I haven't covered it a lot. Because we have a lot of business programming
Sure.
as well, and they do a lot of it. I nearly had a top Russian to come and talk to me, and then they bolt at the last minute. I nearly had, obviously David Cameron has been trying to struggle with this. But here's the thing, I think what's interesting about this is obviously there is a segment of those who've been availing themselves of these opportunities who have done so for greed, money laundering, and all the other things, including some of the people on sanctions. For instance, some Syrians who were on the U.S. sanctions list were able to, be able to use their money thanks to this group and these instruments. It's interesting that it's come to hit David Cameron, although he's done nothing illegal according to everything that's out there. I mean, nothing illegal or improper. It's all been according to the rules.
True.
I
The
guess,
problem is the rules.
Well, apparently, yeah. I mean, people who know more about these things say that you're going to have to decide what the rules are and then make people abide by the rules. Sure. So these are political issues, I think, a lot of them. But it obviously plays into the notion, the very real notion, of the inequality that exists around the world right now. And that is something that's, obviously I see it all the time. And clearly it's playing out in this presidential election, the growing inequality and the shrinking of the middle class. And for that to be happening in the United States is a double shame, really, because the United States is the home of the middle class. And yet we find, actually, there's a lot of crony capitalism, there's a lot of, the system is, as some people say, rigged. That's what some people say. But in other words, people who say that capitalism is not working for them, and that it's still, the best economic system, but it's got to work for everybody. It can't only work for a few people. On the other hand, as I said when I was standing there, you have truly wild promises and pledges being made, whether it's on the extreme left or on the extreme right in this presidential campaign. That if you, read Paul Krugman, or if you read, the FT or whoever, The Economist or whatever, and you see line items about what they're promising, it's A, not achievable, and B, if it was enacted upon, the country would collapse. It's just pie in the sky. And that's what makes me angry, because there are obviously people in this country who are suffering very, very much. And there is obviously a huge inequality, that gap that keeps growing. But the way to deal with it is not to make false promises. The way to deal with it is to get a Congress that works, to get a political system that works, to get compromise, and to go back to some of the old ways where you have two separate and distinct parties, but when it came to the big issues that affected the country, and this is not just this country, it's many other, but it's obviously all eyes are on this country now, that there was, you know, compromise and negotiation and trading and getting things done. And now it's not happening, and it's to all of our detriment.
I agree. I just came back from Korea and was in Israel earlier and Switzerland, and everyone is obsessed with the election.
Yeah.
I don't want to get bogged down in it, but I do want to
No, but
ask
it's not about bogged down. They're right to be obsessed. America is the most important country in the world. America is the most powerful country in the world. America is the strongest economy in the world. When America leads to do good or not good, it makes a difference. It makes a huge difference. So they're right to be obsessed. People are right to be really concerned, because it's not just the President of the United States who's being elected, it's the President of the whole world who's being elected.
Sure, sure. So on that note, I was surprised. I met with some Chinese academics recently, and I was told that Donald Trump was surprisingly, or I was surprised at how popular he is in China. And so it made me wonder, given, you know the world as well as anyone, do you find surprising pockets of support for him, or things that are shocking to you about this election, aside from the sheer fact of it?
You see, I didn't know that about the Chinese, so you've just told me something.
This might be...
Did you ask why?
They kind of explained it as you can imagine his style might play well in China. Maybe. Big buildings with his name, that's something that they're familiar with.
Although the Chinese should know better, because there are whole ghost cities of buildings that are built and unoccupied, you know. So, the view of what I call, I'm a centrist, and I read all sorts of papers, and different, whatever, information. But I am a centrist. I'm extreme on certain things like human rights and genocide and all those kinds of things. No, zero tolerance, right? But on other things, and I put my life on the line to defend those principles and to uncover those deep injustices. But when it comes to things like the economy and foreign policy and things like that, I think there are centrist, sensible policies that can be followed that help everyone and not just one group or the other. And so, in Britain, this whole business about make America great again. So if you listen to the FT, one of the big headlines recently was, don't worry, America, the sky isn't falling. In other words, you are great. Okay? It is true that there is a group, and there is a very strong section of society that have lost their jobs, and that there's all of that needs to be dealt with. But the notion that somehow America needs to go cap in hand begging around the world is just false. It's just false. And to put that narrative out there is dangerous for the United States, actually. You don't want to feel like victims and feel like, oh my goodness, if we don't get, if we don't nuclear arm South Korea and Japan, somehow, we're at risk. I mean, have you ever heard of anything more ridiculous? In this era of nuclear non-proliferation, right? It's outrageous. So I find it difficult to find pockets of support overseas. I mean, I was wondering whether maybe Scotland might be a pocket of support, but they've come out and they've said, we no like you. No. That was my bad Scottish accent.
Okay, let me ask you a little bit about media.
It's fear. People are afraid of that unknown. That's what it is.
I think many of us are. So you started reporting in a very different media world than today's world. And so we know, there was really no internet to speak of. It's completely different today, and obviously much more fractured. So I'm curious, from your vantage point, do you think it's easier or harder in today's climate to get people to focus on the really important issues in the world that really matter?
I think it's more difficult. And I tell you why. Not because there's less information out there, because there isn't. There's much more and much easier accessible. And actually, gosh, I mean, Lord, if I'd had all that at my fingertips back then, it would have been amazing. Wow. But what I find is that it's sort of like it's flash in the pan. You know, it's 15 minutes of attention on that, and then 15 minutes of attention on that, and then 15 minutes of attention on that, instead of, you know, a lot of attention on a few things that are really important. So I find that this whole phenomenon of social media and the whole sort of, you know, things that go viral are viral for a brief second, and then they're gone. Whether it's Bring Back Our Girls from Chibok, really important stuff, to, I don't know, some, you know, pop star's outfit, I don't know. But everything attains equal importance, and therefore nothing is important. And that's scary. It's really, really scary. I remember when we were reporting from Bosnia that, you know, we really felt we were doing really important stuff. And actually, it was really important. And our organizations thought it was really important, and it was on the front page of every newspaper as, you know, top of every news bulletin for years, and on the desk of all the world leaders for years, until they finally did something about it. And here you feel that, you know, okay, Syria flares, you know, there's some horrible thing happens, and then, oh, we'll say a couple of platitudes, and then that'll be gone. You know, I mean, I spent a week in Paris during Charlie Hebdo. I used to be based for CNN in Paris, so I know it very well. And I was there for Charlie Hebdo, which is, you know, yet another direct assault on us. And if anybody wants to ask me about it, I'm happy to talk about it, because some people thought maybe they had it coming to them. Well, I really do actually have a very clear answer to that. And then, you know, young people, you know, dancing and going to music or football or whatever, or eating in restaurants, mowed down, you know. And and yes, everybody was glued to it for about a week or so of wall-to-wall coverage. And then what? And then what? And at the same time, in France, budgets are being cut for counterterrorism police. The same in Belgium. The same, for all I know, here. I don't know about budgets. Actually, I may have misspoken, because in the United States and in Britain, after 9/11 and after 7/7, a real reorganization and stepping up of security and all of that has been very effective, very, very effective. But, you know, one of the other big untold stories, I think, around the world is this obsession with money and profit, to the extent that it is really harming our safety and our security, our education, all of that kind of stuff. Schools are under-resourced. As I say, police departments are under-resourced. Science and other areas are under-resourced in various, you know, parts of the world. Infrastructure is under-resourced. You know, you've got in England, for instance, just for instance, you've got all of this building and renovation going on, but guess who it's for? It's for a bunch of expats who want to come and dump their money there, Chinese, Russian, maybe even Brits. Put their money there. So you've got all these empty apartments. Meanwhile, my team of university graduates who work on my show and who are in their 20s or early 30s cannot afford to buy an apartment in London. They could pay the mortgage, but they can't afford the down payment. And there's something wrong with our society right now in a very fundamental way. Our youth are not being cared for in the way, you know, are not feeling that they can get that foot on the ladder like we felt we could. Sure. I mean, I started to work for $10,000 a year in 1983. But then, you know, I had a crappy little rent of $300 in Atlanta, Georgia. And I wasn't married, and I didn't have a kid, and, you know, it was okay. I didn't have much spare money, but that's what it was. And then, you know, you work yourself up. And these kids are working their way up, and they can't, even a one-bedroom or a studio apartment. It's not right. While all these apartments are, you know, all these multi-million-dollar apartments are sort of going begging and empty because some, you know, it's just rubbish.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And
I'm sure that's happening here too.
It is. It is.
You know?
They're all up in the hills.
Yeah. And it does. And you know, look, again, I read an article today, and it makes you question, because so I have, you know, I'm paid very well. But you know what? I'm proud of being paid well because I'm a woman. And I insist on being paid equal pay for equal play. And I want everybody to make salaries transparent so there's no more of this gender disparity. But there's being paid...
transparent.
Yeah, to be honest with you. Barack Obama and David Cameron have started to say that, certainly David Cameron, some of the 100 or so big corporations in Britain have to start being transparent about their bonuses, their salaries, all of that kind of stuff, so that you can, you know, stop this massive gap of disparity for exactly equal work between men and women. And I think that's really, really smart. So there's being well paid, and then there's being obscenely paid. You know, it doesn't compute today. There may have been a time when it was okay, but it's not all right today.
Sure. By the way, in the state of California, for state employees, it is in fact fully transparent.
Good.
Now, I don't know whether it's had the effect that you spoke of, but
yeah.
It's
well,
fully
I mean, this is, you know, it's a progressive thing. But you know, I have a 16-year-old son, and soon he's going to want to go to college. Well, I'm lucky I can afford to send him through college. But what about all the people who have to go into terrible debt? Is it okay for 20-year-olds to come out, or 21-year-olds to come out of college, and the first thing they have to do is get rid of this massive monkey on their shoulders, which is thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of debt? It's immoral. But on the other hand, free education isn't going to be working either.
No.
You know, so there has to be, you know, some kind of sensible way to get through this.